To really understand the first reading today, you have to situate yourself in that world. So cast your mind back multiplicity of centuries and into the Babylonian Empire, where the people of ancient Egypt sit scattered and in darkness and grieving. They had been in their own land, living as the covenanted people of God, but then their worship degraded, and worship no longer connected to justice, and they made a lot of foreign policy errors. And God warned them again and again through the prophets that they better think hard about what it is that they're doing, but no one listened. And so armies invaded, and starvation and war and eventually exile are what resulted. And so clans were scattered and families are grieving, and the people feel abandoned, particularly wondering if they're abandoned by God. Because if they don't belong to God, then maybe they just don't belong, period. Because it's God who made them a people in the first place. Oh, backtrack a few more centuries, and there was this man named Abraham, and in the grace of God, God told Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And those descendants were enslaved in Egypt and cried out, and God heard. God remembered God's promises, led them out through parted waters, Moses, you might remember that whole story, and into a promised land. And God covenanted with them to uniquely be their God. No pantheon here. Just God and the people, and they would live by a law with a certain kind of worship, and that would bless the nations. God formed them. God cared for them. They belonged to God, and this was their home space in their land. Until, of course, they violated the covenant. See my previous paragraph. And then they end up in exile. And maybe God is finally breaking God's side of the covenant. The people break theirs first, and maybe God really is done with them, leaving them to just sit in exile, leaving them alone, because then none of it matters. If you have no God, what's the point of a temple? And if God gave them the land, then maybe the land isn't theirs anyway, because now they're in exile. And maybe they just don't belong at all. And so then you get the middle of the portion of the book of Isaiah. Scholars call it Second Isaiah. It's a small book of comfort. And chapter 43 is a little bit the middle of it. And God says through this prophet, speak to Israel. It is I, God, who formed you. I made you. And it is I who will redeem you. I think it's incredible that God in this passage connects creation with redemption. That which God has created, God does not forget, and God will redeem it. God created Israel as a nation and the people. That doesn't mean God forgets them. It means that when things go wrong, God does not abandon them, and God will redeem them and bring them back. God calls to the four directions in this passage. From the south, give them up, and from the east, bring back my sons and daughters, and from the north and from the west, I will call the scattered tribes together. There is no distance God cannot overcome to bring God's people back. And in the middle of the passage, 2 times in this pericope, in this small section, God says, do not be afraid. I have called you by name, and you are mine. Because what is God addressing? Their fundamental fear that they no longer belong to God. And so God says twice, do not be afraid of that. You belong to me. I formed you. I will redeem you. I call you by name, and I will go to the ends of all of the earth to bring you back. You are mine. And I wonder, though, I never think ancient Israel is alone. In many ways, they're paradigmatic. It seems like one of the core fears that they have about belonging is just kind of one of the core fears of what it is to be human. About whether we belong to a God, or we belong in a space, or whether we actually belong to anybody at all. I mean, we know that small children who don't know if they belong to their family, right, they fail to thrive. And even little kids explore what it means to belong. Broke my heart. I don't talk about my kid much, so this is an anomaly if you're new, but he came home the other day and declared he wanted to start wearing short sleeves to school. I said, "Are you hot?" "No, but my friend wears short sleeves." See? It's not trivial. He's trying to figure out where he belongs. It's so important. And he will spend the rest of his life, because we as adults, we still spend a ton of time figuring out if we belong. Do I belong in this friend group? Do I belong in this space? And then there are huge overarching national arguments about who belongs where and how. And if my family has a rift in it, there's a divorce or a death, or my kids go to college, then where do I belong now? And Carl Jung would say that one of the deepest questions of our life and our greatest fear is sort of like exploring our own hearts. Like the parts of ourselves we don't know and don't like that much. But that seems to me a core question of belonging too. Like, do I even belong to my own self? Is there so much about me I don't know? Do I even belong to me? And you have a lot of people who name death as the core fear, but what is death other than what feels like the greatest break in belonging? You break from all the human company you know when you die. And of course, some people push off belonging. I don't need that. I am a lone wolf, and I will survive by myself. Let me put my armor on and walk out. But isn't that also just sort of in its rejection, a sort of obsessing about belonging also? And I think it's really interesting that in the early church, they picked up this passage from Isaiah 43, and they used it to understand baptism. When you walk through the waters, says God. And yes, that has ancient resonance, right? God is talking to the people who literally God walked through the waters out of Egypt. Remember that, says God? I will be there. But because we read Scripture, we can say that stands alone, and we can do some reading and find resonance in it. And the resonance there is baptismal. When you walk through the waters, when you go under the waters of baptism, you are claimed. I have formed you in the waters of baptism, says God. I have claimed you, and I have redeemed you, and I have called you by name, and you are mine. No matter who you are, no matter who you are becoming, you belong to God in the most fundamental way that is unshakable. Because you and I don't act in the waters of baptism. It's God who acts. And what God does cannot be undone. And God has claimed you. And God has formed you and is forming you in the image of his Son. Creation and redemption together again. You belong to God. And here's the thing about that, though. If we fundamentally belong to God, the God who formed all of us and the God who redeemed us all in the one man, Jesus Christ, then it turns out we all belong to God and we all belong to one another. Paul says profoundly, once you're baptized, the categories are donezo. There is no slave or free. There is no Greek or Jew. There is no male or female. It's irrelevant. You are all beloved children of the one God. You belong to God and you belong to one another. And that's the most profound piece, I think, of what it is to be and do church. That we belong together as God's people. And when we walk through the fires of life, we do it together. And when the water feels like it's rising up to our necks, we know we're not alone. And when we come into this place, we call each other by name because God has called us by name and taught us how to do it. And when new people walk through the doors, it's not like, oh, Melinda wants us to say hi. No, it's not about the institution. It's about being the people of God because we belong together. And the power of the church then is knowing that everyone who isn't hanging out with us or not yet hanging out with us, they belong to God too. And that's when the church changes the world. Because God cares about every single person surrounding us and what their life is like because they belong to God. And we should know their names and we should walk through the fire and we should walk through the water with them. That's how we are changed and how the world is changed. And whenever we think that the fire is going to burn us or we're going to be swept away, and it happens to all of us, we have to remember Isaiah. And we have to remember our baptisms, that God has formed us, that God redeems us, and that God calls each of us by name. I have called you by name, says God, and you are mine. You, in all of who you are, belong to God. And God claims you now and before you knew who you were and long after this world is over. That's where our home is. Our home is in God together. We belong to God. Thanks be to God.